In the name of the one who sustains, renews, and always pursues us. Amen. Please have a seat. Good morning. I am humbled and honored to worship with you today and to offer you a word of reflection on a day we mark in our church calendar as Christ the King Sunday. As Dean Malloy said, my name is Lydia Bucklin, and I serve as the president and dean of Episcopal Divinity School, which is one of the historic seminaries of the Episcopal Church. EDS, as we're also known, is a school dedicated to forming leaders with moral courage for social change in their local communities. It's a task that feels more important than ever in today's climate of fear and division and increasing violence. My home is in northern Michigan, actually in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, on the ancestral and current homelands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy, located on the shores of Lake Superior. It is a beautiful, sacred place to call home. As I mentioned, churches all over the world are celebrating Christ the King Sunday today. And the designation of this day is interestingly a rather new addition to our church calendar. It wasn't until 1925 that Pope Pius XI instituted the Feast of Christ the King to make it clear to Christians that Christ reigns, that despite what the world says, Christ, and not the rulers of this world, reigns supreme. Some historical background is that Christ the King Sunday was created as a counter-response to the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, who, using control, violence, and power, had become the supreme ruler of Italy, declaring himself the heir to the Roman Empire. Mussolini wanted ultimate control, and he wanted Italy to be the ultimate nation. He himself coined the term fascism, advocating for the emergence of a dictator who, in his words, described that role as a man who is ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep, to confront the economic and political crisis that was then gripping Italy. Mussolini caught the imagination of the crowds. His attitudes were highly theatrical. His opinions were contradictory, his facts were often wrong, and his attacks were frequently malicious and misdirected. But his words were so dramatic, and his metaphors were so apt and striking, his vigorous, repetitive gestures so extraordinarily effective, that he rarely failed to inspire his crowd and impose his mood. Many Italians, especially among the middle class, welcomed this authority. They were tired of strikes and riots and economic instability, and they were ready to submit to dictatorship, especially if it meant that the national economy would be stabilized and their country restored to its dignity. Mussolini seemed to them to be the one man capable of bringing order out of chaos. And so, in defiance of Mussolini's reign, Christ the King Sunday was established, in which the church insisted that love in the way of Christ, not hate and fear, ruled supreme. Now, like most church history, there's always more to the story than what's written, so it's important to note the tension here that Pope Pius XI's motivations were not quite rooted in liberation. He, in fact, as head of the church, was vying for power and was creating for himself a role of absolute sovereign power over Vatican City. It's ironic that what was meant to be a theological declaration of Christ's reign as separate from and free from corrupt human structures was itself rooted in a Christian institution that itself was utilizing Christ's image to legitimate and sacralize their own power. Throughout our own country's history, we know, in fact, that Christ's reign has been used to justify settler colonialism, the stealing of land, the enslavement of millions of people, and the genocide of indigenous communities, both literally and culturally, with the doctrine of discovery, and residential boarding schools set up in partnership with churches and government. It's complicated, and it's messy. And like most metaphors, this description of Christ as King is imperfect. So bear with me here. The imagery of Christ as King appears in our scriptures a number of times. We find it in the book of Revelation and in the Gospel of John, and even in our nativity story by the Magi who come to see baby Jesus, who they referred to as the King of the Jews. And it makes me wonder what all of this means for us today. In a time when the world once again is descending into aggression, fear, and separation, with war and genocide, violence, poverty, and environmental crisis all around us, how do we hold true to this belief that it is actually God who reigns over us? And if it is Christ, God made human, who rules everything, including the future of every person, nation, and leader, then our scriptures also promise that God's reign will provide basic security for life, so that, as Psalm 93 describes, the whole world is so sure that it cannot be moved. If Jesus is king, the whole notion of kingship, kingdom, is flipped upside down, and there's no more suffering. This, my friends, might be a hard thing to believe right now for some of us. And if it's not a hard thing personally, then it's certainly hard for some of our most vulnerable neighbors to believe. That in the end, love and peace and security are promised. That the forces of hatred have time and time again used fear to drive out love. But our collective history around the world is littered with examples of leaders who have insisted that the only way to survive is to care for our own, to fear the other, and to create more walls of division. How do we make sense of a world so seemingly out of control? We don't. We contract inward. We seek self-protection. And this world around us becomes more hostile and more frightening. We want to feel secure. We want to feel rescued from the chaos. We want to be taken care of. And so we turn to those who will gladly take on this role of dictator and king. And in playing to our fears, these leaders, these rulers, dominate our hearts and our minds and convince us that the only safe place is one in which we withdraw and isolate and gather up whatever we have and hoard it for ourselves and our families. Because when the sky is falling and everything is crumbling around us, the most we are told we can hope for at least is a satisfying private life. But that is not the way of Christ. That is not the way of God's love. And that is not God's dream for us. Instead, we are invited to look more closely at how our brother Jesus lived his life. And his life was always in community. Every act of healing, every act of love, his was a life in which he came to serve and not to be served. The kind of leadership he modeled for us is one in which he was less concerned about who sat on the right or left of him, but instead whether there were enough seats at the table and whether there was enough food to feed everyone who was hungry. Here in today's gospel reading stands Jesus, beaten and scorned, ridiculed, flogged, and mocked by soldiers. Hardly the image of a king. And Jesus says, "My kingdom," or as I like to imagine he might say, "my kingdom," is not of this world. The kingdoms of this world insist on their own sovereignty, but the kingdom of Jesus Christ, God's reign, is all-encompassing, and the reign of Jesus is the reign of truth. To understand Jesus as king is to turn upside down all earthly ideas of kingship. Because while an earthly ruler is coercive, our divine ruler is redemptive. While an earthly king is obsessed with military victory, our heavenly king promises peace. While an earthly, power-hungry leader encourages hoarding of all of our earthly resources into the hands of just a few, our divine one insists on generosity and hospitality. The most important attributes of our divine ruler, Jesus, are love and kindness and justice. Yes, our history is littered with foolish, greedy, hate-filled leaders who would rather us turn against each other than turn towards one another. But our history is also full of people who choose a different way. Those who choose love. Those who choose to come together and choose liberation. Margaret Wheatley, an inspiring author and thought leader on social change, asks, is it possible to create islands of sanity in the midst of a raging, destructive sea? I love that image. Is it possible to create islands of sanity in the midst of a raging, destructive sea? The human spirit can be and often is crushed by fear and hatred. But the human spirit can also be restored and empowered by love. The human spirit is an amazing and fragile work of beauty. We can choose to live in fear or we can choose to live in hope. Our fears can feed hatred. Our hopes can feed love. Once again, we find ourselves surrounded by those who seek power by playing to our fears. Symbols that we thought had been banished to the pages of our history books are showing up in our local communities like Columbus, Ohio, as masked individuals with Nazi symbols march through the streets in the name of hate. And sometimes the truth of that horror is so overwhelming that we begin to fear and wonder if fear itself might conquer us. But fear, as scary and uncomfortable as it is part of the human journey. Parker Palmer, a Quaker educator and writer, notes that the human experience is so underlined by fear that all of our spiritual traditions at their core address the effects of fear on our lives. With different words, all of these great faith traditions basically say, be not afraid. But he points out they do not say we should not have fears. Instead, we do not need to be our fears. When fear shows up, it doesn't mean we failed or that we should pull back and withdraw into ourselves, but rather we do not give fear the power to silence or stop us. Even when it feels like everything is falling apart, we are invited to pause, to breathe, to take the time we need, and then to imagine a new way forward. One in which superiority is replaced by mutuality. Superiority, you see, is not an act of love. Words used to dominate, coerce, manipulate, and destroy are not the words of our true ruler and guide. And values like dominion, control, and all-encompassing materialism are not the values of Christ's kingdom, which we are a part. If the voice in our head tells us that things are hopeless, we have to turn from that lie and embrace the hope of resurrection. If any person, circumstance, or power tells us that we are worthless or less than, we have to denounce that authority and accept our value as the beloved of God. If all we see around us is decay and destruction, we must tune in to the voice of life. Those usual voices, media and public opinion, the pursuit of possessions and status, hold no sway over us. The voice of God, our King, our Queen, our Creator, our Sustainer and Redeemer, isn't just another voice. It is the voice we must listen to. And when we respond to that voice, we find liberation. We find ourselves liberated from the voices and pressures and wildly spinning lies that beckon and demand our obedience and our time and our resources. And if sometimes we aren't sure whose voice it is that we're following, know this: the voice of God does not crush us. The voice of our Creator lifts us into the joy of being the person we are in our sweetest dreams. The only thing big enough to hold all of this pain and brokenness in the world is love. And with Jesus as our guide, we find ourselves in a world in which it is easier to love. And thanks be to God for that. Amen.